So welcome everyone. This is Bruce Baker, and this is another video in the series on the history of New Orleans. And I'm speaking today with Professor Scott Marler of the University of Memphis. And he's the author of a book from 2013 on Cambridge University Press, which is in a lot of ways, I don't want to say the only, but in some ways, the only real thorough history of the New Orleans business community in the 19th century. And it's called the Merchants' Capital, which I think has it's the capital city of merchants, and it's also very much about merchant capital, merchant capitalism. So thanks for joining us, Scott. I really appreciate your time. I was wondering maybe if we could start out just by sort of laying out, we're going to talk about some of the things mostly in the first chapter of your book, but then also some of these broader questions that it opens out into. And maybe a starting point is, as the economy of the city develops in the period after it's acquired by the United States, how important are these distinctions between Creole merchants and American merchants? That is to say, merchants who are not sort of native New Orleanian and who have come in after 1803.
Well, thanks for inviting me first. I appreciate the chance to be here. It is important to kind of understand what Creole means because it's defined differently by different historians, different types of historians, cultural historians define it a little differently, and contemporaries did. But generally, it meant people, as you point out, who were native to New Orleans, multi-generational, and usually of a non-English stock. So French and the Spanish had both ruled over New Orleans since its establishment at one time or another. The British had a very small window in the 1760s. So the Creole community is the longest established in New Orleans, over a century old, although some of those people have come in at times like after the Haitian Revolution in 1804. You had an incoming tide of immigrants from the former French colony. So the distinctions between those families, those Creole families and their merchant businesses, and the Americans who come in beginning in the early part of the century, mainly after the Louisiana Purchase, are important. These ethnocultural differences rise time and time again, both through the antebellum and into the post-Civil War period. How important are they? Is that kind of your question?
Yeah, sort of how important are they? How long do these sort of identifications and these sort of, this sort of sense of difference between these merchants coming from these different backgrounds, how long does that persist? I mean, I assume at some point, there's not really a distinction except somebody has a French or Spanish surname and somebody else has a more typically English surname or something.
Well, they persist throughout the century. In fact, you can find some persistence up on pretty much to the present day amongst native New Orleanians. But sticking with the 19th century, it's like any ethnic distinctions or ethnocultural distinctions, it trucks in stereotypes. So the stereotype of the Creole businessman was one who was indolent and lazy and didn't care much to the attention of businesses, tended to invest in things like real estate, in which they could become landlords and make money off of the hardworking Americans who opposed them. And at the same time, the Creoles made their own stereotypes about Americans as grasping opportunists who were insufficiently averse to risk, and just out to make a quick buck and not stay in New Orleans and establish the sorts of roots in the city that would help it to grow in a manner more similar to that of other cities. So there's like a kernel of truth, perhaps, to some of these stereotypes. One other thing I should mention about the stereotypes of Creoles is that they're very often linked to racial stereotypes. So Creole also has a racial dimension in a city that is multiracial, both of free blacks, as well as, of course, a large population of slaves. So there's an undercurrent sometimes that becomes explicit of racism to Americans who represent this growing portion of New Orleans population in the first half of the century. There's this undercurrent of racism attacking Creole businessmen as well, many of whom, some of whom at least, are free blacks of very light complexion.
That's really interesting, and it sort of reminds me of something we were chatting about briefly just before we started recording. That might be a good sort of moment to sort of come into, and that is what you were saying about sort of the nature of merchant capital sort of suppressing class cohesion as opposed to industrial capital.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's kind of the overarching theme of my book, and trying to describe why New Orleans, as this merchant's capital in two dimensions, declines so rapidly. As I put it, after the Civil War, New Orleans falls from economic grace faster than any other first-rank American city ever has, in my opinion. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of conservative, hidebound nature of the particular type of capital that merchants represent, as opposed to the industrial capitalism described so well by classical political economists, whether Adam Smith or Karl Marx. They tend to find agreement that industrial capitalism helps to develop classes that, despite their continual competition with each other, nonetheless are able to display the sort of team spirit that allows them to sponsor things like infrastructural improvements that benefit all of them. Merchant capitalists aren't like that. Merchant capitalists are so in and of the moment, making their profits not off of fixed investments like factories, but off of exchange differentials that fluctuate widely, differentials between distant markets. And for a number of reasons, that type of capital deployment tends not to foster that kind of unity that characterizes a solid, cohesive class, whether in the Marxist or the classic sense, the sociological sense. And that helps to suppress the sorts of things that might have allowed New Orleans to achieve a more durable economic stature in America than it ultimately did.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially what you were saying about the kind of reluctance of merchant capital to invest in the kinds of permanent improvements and infrastructure improvements and so forth that we would associate with industrial capital, particularly because New Orleans, as we're for this series, we're also reading Ari Kelman's book, and that really emphasizes a lot of the just sort of physical infrastructure challenges of New Orleans as a trading city. So New Orleans as a city 100 miles up a big river and so forth has some challenges that maybe New York, for instance, doesn't in terms of infrastructure. So if you don't have these sort of the sense of permanence of industrial capital saying, we're going to be here and it's worth investing, then that probably is part. Would you say that's maybe part of why they just continually have these long running problems about what to do with the infrastructure and what to do with the sandbar at the mouth of the river, and the wharves are always falling apart and things like that?
Right. Merchant capitalists were, again, another hallmark of merchant capital is its migratory nature. It doesn't have any sort of fixed area of settlement often. That's one of the things that Adam Smith pointed out in The Wealth of Nations. And so if you're not going to be really fixed or attached to a particular location as your center of business, you're not going to want to be taxed collectively in order to sponsor the kinds of things like improving the wharves, improving transportation in and out of the city, dredging the rivers, helping build levees. These were the sorts of things that New Orleans business community, which was dominated by its merchant class, were unable to sponsor. And by the time they started thinking about it, it was in many ways far too late. Technology and techniques and circumstances had just long gone past them.
And other cities had just really overtaken them. Uh, Another thing that sort of arose in terms of a sort of another avenue of division and potential conflict is the relationship between merchants and bankers. And how would you say that sort of develops?
Well, it's tempting at times, and if you read classical political economy, and here I'm thinking a lot of Karl Marx, who was a big influence on me. Both Marx and Smith talk about a division of labor between capitals. In other words, we're accustomed to thinking about forms of labor in different ways. There's unskilled labor and skilled labor. There's all these different ways, but you don't usually hear of capitalists being subdivided according to the different functions that they have. So in that sense, merchant capital, to the degree that it's acknowledged, sometimes lumps together bankers with it. It's used synonymous with financial capital. Well, it's not the same thing. They're very closely related, but bankers make their profits in very different ways. Their interests are very much intertwined because merchants rely on short-term credit to do business from year to year. And given the amount of money that was flowing from those commodity trading activities from merchants, bankers were eager to get their hands and their share of that pie. So you find many merchants either as presidents of, or certainly on the boards of directors of the banking community in New Orleans, which was the second largest banking community in the country to New York City through the first half of the 19th century. And at times, it's their collective capitalization, the amount of wealth that those banks controlled. There were a few times, like just before the Panic of 1837, where they actually had more in their banks than New York did. But the divisions between merchants and bankers become manifest, particularly when times get bad, like after the Panic of 1837.
I think a lot of times when we think about the Panic of 1837, we often think about the, quite immediate and really significant effects it has on the development of kind of the southwestern cotton frontier. But what effects would you say it has within the city of New Orleans itself over the sort of short term and medium term?
Well, it does exacerbate those differences between merchants and bankers who begin to see that their interests are not always the same. So I talk about a towering figure of New Orleans and frankly national finance named Edmund Forstall, who was himself a Creole. And Forstall, who was styled himself as a commission merchant, someone who sold cotton and sugar at great distances, but was really as well known, and ultimately his reputation lasts as long as it does, for his activities as a banker. So Forstall ends up getting a lot of blame from planters and merchants alike for his activities prior to the war in his role as the president of a couple of banks that were established during the boom times of the early 1830s. He's accused of sponsoring overly risky activities and extending, credit based on a real estate bubble that he should have seen was coming. Well, actually, none of that was Forstall's fault. In fact, he had resigned from the presidency of at least one of those banks in part because of that. Forstall also got a lot of criticism for his connections to foreign capital in Europe, particularly the House of Baring out of Britain, Baring Brothers, which is, I believe, still around, if I'm not mistaken. But Absent that sort of investment, New Orleans banks wouldn't have grown as large as they did. Well, after the Panic of 1837, Forstall becomes a target of criticism for precisely the opposite, for sponsoring reforms of regional banking that emphasized stability, that emphasized that banks needed to maintain very strictly, according to government oversight, specific ratios of reserves to the amount of loans that they put out, to their investments. Those loans are for bankers' investments. And that tightened up the regional money supply. And that, by the time this recovery begins in the about 5 years in early 1840s, planters are screaming bloody murder, as are some merchants, that they can't get loans on as easy a terms as they used to, because banks, according to Forstall's reforms, which have been enshrined in state law by that point, are making it more difficult for them to make money hand over fist in the way they had prior to the Panic of 1837. In other words, they didn't learn any of the lessons that had brought about that financial panic. A lot of things contributed to it, but in terms of their own responsibilities for it, they didn't learn. They wanted to go back to the old ways that had helped destabilize that system, or create a banking system that was so unstable that it just took a little push to knock it down.
Yeah, that's interesting. That, again, another sort of example of the kind of lack of harmony of interests and views between merchants and bankers. If we sort of move forward to the 1850s, by the 1850s, New Orleans has fairly largely, from what you argue there, fairly largely lost control of the trade of the upper Midwest, or the upper Mississippi River Valley, the grain that they'd been accustomed to getting and so forth. What are some of the reasons for that? And then does the sort of losing the trade of the sort of upper Mississippi River Valley also affect New Orleans' handling of the cotton trade? Or is that fine and that's sort of totally separate?
Well, most economists, I think, would tell you, and businessmen of the day argued repeatedly the seriousness of the consequences of losing control of, or even market share of, the fast-growing Midwestern grain trade. Now, there was an allusion to that insofar as, since the value of those grain products continued to increase, the amount that was still flowing into New Orleans gave the illusion that things were remaining relatively constant. But people that were more in the know realized that the actual physical amount of that grain, particularly as a percentage of what was being produced nationwide, particularly in the Midwestern states, had declined precipitously. So my original point I was going to start with is that one of the ways that urban centers thrive, particularly over the long term, is by having diversified economies. And if you're overly reliant on one commodity like cotton, then you're unlikely to have the sort of diversified economy that is able to weather recessions, depressions, financial panics, etc. And that's sort of what happened to New Orleans. Their merchant community grew so complacent with this fast-growing cotton economy and the profits they could wheedle out of it, which were based on their fixed commissions of the sales that they intermediated, helped allow them to sort of ignore this shifting of the grain trade to being accommodated by new east-west routes, first centering on the Great Lakes and the canal system that was growing in the 1820s and 1830s. And by the 1840s and especially 1850s, east-west routes become dominated by railroads, of which New Orleans basically had none. And that continued until after the Civil War, despite some really hilarious attempts for New Orleans merchants to try to get together and sponsor their own railroad construction, it was a hallmark of their lack of class cohesion that they didn't. So the loss of the grain trade was both cause and symptom of New Orleans' decline. It was a cause insofar as it helped to create an economy that was less diversified, more committed to the exchange differentials based on one commodity, maybe two if you count sugar. And at the same time, it was a symptom insofar as it was symptomatic of that inability of merchants to do anything except sit and congratulate themselves and New Orleans on its favored position at the bottom of the Mississippi River system, which they felt would ensure New Orleans' commercial dominance more or less forever, which of course it didn't.
Yeah, and so it sort of sounds like, I think a lot of times, obviously the Civil War is a huge turning point in everything in US history in all sorts of different ways. And I suppose in the context of New Orleans, it might be very easy to say, well, the war came and that totally disrupted things. But I was wondering what you thought about, had the war not happened, what was the likely fate of the New Orleans economy? In other words, was it kind of in this sort of decline that some lesser sort of shock would have really wrecked things by the end of the 1850s?
I think the war hastened the decline of New Orleans, but no, I think these trends were already well underway. The growth of other cities, both in the South and on the border regions contiguous to New Orleans, as well as the growth of major commercial centers like Boston and New York elsewhere, who resented the sort of arrogant attitudes of New Orleans merchants and their monopolistic position over the cotton trade, it cut into their profits. So merchant communities and business communities, bankers, and industrialists, frankly, on the Atlantic seaboard, had incentives, economic incentives, to develop new techniques of organizing as well as new technologies that would allow them to transport goods and bypass New Orleans. And these trends were already well underway prior to the Civil War. That the Civil War hastened them, particularly vis-a-vis the destruction of the New Orleans banking community and the capital assets that it represented. The war hastened the destruction of New Orleans' dominance in financial system, also in part because so much of that money, so much of that wealth was based on the collateral that slaves represented as a form of investment, as a form of capital accumulation, which was wiped off the books by emancipation, which thoroughly destabilized the system. But I digress. The point is that I do think that New Orleans' decline was, barring a complete about face of their community, of their merchant community towards their long-term investment patterns, which was really unlikely. It continued to be unlikely after the war. They didn't even display these tendencies. I think New Orleans was sort of destined to fall by the wayside, perhaps not as swiftly as it did. The rise of other port cities like Galveston and port cities in Florida, Mobile, were already challenging New Orleans' dominance. Well, Galveston more so after the war.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that excellent book on Galveston called Galveston and the Great West by, I think it's Earl Young, that really sort of describes a merchant community that is almost the exact opposite of New Orleans. They're on the ball, they're looking for opportunities, they're cooperating together and so forth. And they're sort of doing all the things that they need to do to sort of, building infrastructure in terms of a seawall and things like that. Which goes really well until the 1900 hurricane anyway.
Right. I lived in Galveston for 8 years, so.
Oh, right. Wow. Well, it sounds like a delightful place. Well, we certainly could digress for, an indefinite amount of time, but that may try both your generosity and the patience of viewers who, some of this economic stuff is tricky, particular sort of stuff. So if maybe we could wrap up a little bit just by saying a little bit about sort of methodological stuff in terms of what sorts of sources did you use? How did you use sources maybe differently than people had before? That's certainly a bit of a sense that I had in reading the book.
Well, thanks. I guess in a way it's hard for me to talk about that without referring back to the tract of how the dissertation from which this book arose developed. For almost 5 years, this was going to be a dissertation about the importance of country stores, which is a perennial topic in Southern history, particularly after the Civil War. Well, I banged my head against this subject for several years insofar as these country merchants, who were important both before and after the war, simply didn't leave the sorts of detailed records that I really needed to answer the kinds of aggregate questions about their role, economic role in particular. And I was reaching the point where I was going to have to talk about these country store merchants in small towns in the South organizing volunteer fire companies and things like that. And I'm like, this is not what I want my PhD for. And I just had an epiphany. I'm a native New Orleanian, and I don't know why it took me so long, but one time I was, out of town with my wife, and she encouraged me to think outside the box. She could tell I was miserable. And I said, well, I could bring New Orleans into the picture. And it was just like a flash in my head, eureka. Now, this is almost 5 years into the topic. So my dissertation, I ran to him and said, I want to include New Orleans. And he wrung his hands. John Bowles, good man. Well, you're kind of 5 years out. I said, let me do it. I can do it. There's so much out there on New Orleans. And so I did. In about 18 months of research, I had gathered probably at least 3 times as much as I had in almost 5 years on country stores. And it was thick, these merchants left letters, they left detailed business records in the aggregate. And so it was a lot easier for me to start talking about them, particularly in relation to the country stores, as well as their own internal dynamics. Newspapers, multiple newspapers were available, journals and diaries and various firsthand narrative accounts of people who made visits to the city. So, I just felt blessed all of a sudden after going through this desert of a paucity of sources for a few years. Suddenly I had an embarrassment of riches, and enough that I was able to do the sorts of aggregate analysis that impresses more mainstream economic historians. Don't have any advanced degrees in statistics, but some of the more basic questions about the degree of New Orleans dominance of the Southern economy had never really been asked. And I think I was able to at least put some of that data together in one place in my book.
That's really interesting. And I think it's so often, it explains a lot. I mean, the book is a great work, and I think it'll hold up for a long, long time. And it hangs together really well, but it's also really interesting to hear the background, and it sort of makes me think about the chapter on country stores slightly differently, to sort of realize that was sort of the original bit of it. And wow, what an 18 months that must have been.
It was fun though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of spending time in these backwater burgs in Louisiana, I got to stay in New Orleans for weeks and weeks at a time. Yay!
Well, exactly. As a not to diss where I'm from, but as somebody who wrote a lot of history about South Carolina and North Carolina for a number of years, writing history about New Orleans has certain research advantages in terms of when the archives close. Yes, so that's really nice. Well, I'd just like to thank you again for taking the time to talk about your book with us. And wish you all the best in a slightly unusual time and with your current research. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Take care.